What I really want to do is talk about the lessons that have been learned about historic preservation, and kind of the economic side, and some studies that our firm and others have done. But I want to start out with you all about some kind of basic understandings. And by the way, the mayor and I didn't coordinate our presentations, but we're absolutely on target. First of all, if you're going to start talking about this economic benefit, you have to move beyond the monument. You can't just be thinking about the mansions of rich dead white guys. Now, so I'm glad somebody deals with those, but that is no longer what preservation is about. And there really is going to be limited economic impact if you're only thinking on the monument level. Second, and it is exactly what the mayor has said, there has to be a commitment to adaptive reuse. And we're so used to that in America. We're so used to recognizing if these buildings are going to have an active role, we got to figure out how to adaptively reuse them. I have to tell you, in much of the world that still isn't true. There is this kind of, we got to put walls around stuff and keep them separate from the rest of it. It's just not going to work in a market economy and not in our economy. And the levels that, the ways that historic preservation impacts the economy, directly and indirectly, and I'll talk kind of the metrics of some of that, but also functionally and by providing the context. And again here, we just heard the mayor talk about in terms of what's happening in downtown Little Rock. I'm telling you, it's going to be the context of the historic buildings that will set the pattern, both in design and in use, of the technology buildings that are going to be built there, and that's a major role. In fact, I'm not so sure that in the middle of the 21st century, when someone writes the history of the historic preservation movement at the beginning of the century, that it's not, the success is not going to be in terms of the number of buildings sold. It's going to be on the impact that historic preservation has had on the quality of design of new buildings. And I think that's in fact a valuable contribution that historic preservation will make. But there's a challenge in doing this kind of economic evaluation of preservation's impact. First of all, there's no such thing as a preservation industry. You know, you have an automobile industry, and you have the law industry, and you have the cattle industry. There's no such thing as the preservation industry. It's all these kind of little separate things. Second is that when you do this kind of analysis, it has to be done simultaneously for a variety of different audiences. It has to be done for national governments. It has to meet the tests, the kind of robustness of academic institutions and levels of government, and both elected officials and staff to those governments, and to preservation advocates. And it's not easy to both do the research and communicate the research that simultaneously is understandable and credible to all of those audiences. The third is with these different ways of trying to look at components of economic impact of preservation. In fact, it requires a whole different sets of methodologies within one study to make it all work. Oh, by the way, in case any of you, are scribbling stuff are going to get, sore fingers, I'm going to leave all the PowerPoint stuff, and it'll be redistributed to anybody who wants it in PDF form, so you don't have to do that. Second, and this is, it's often a conflict with sometimes PhDs in federal government and people on academic institutions, but you have to have the research that's robust, but you have to write it in a fashion that actual human beings can understand what you're talking about. And then the fifth value, or fifth challenge of trying to make this analysis is there's lots of values of historic preservation that are not economic values. They're real values. They're just not economic. They're not quantifiable in terms with a dollar in front of them. So all of those are challenges in doing this kind of analysis. In fact, again, heritage conservation has, and you would all say this, has this wide range of values: aesthetic value and social, and environmental and cultural and educational. All are real values, some of which in fact are measurable in historic preservation. But if the economic value is not there, the buildings will be lost. And if the buildings are lost, all of the rest of those values are lost as well. Historic buildings can't serve their educational or aesthetic or cultural or social role if they're not there. And they're not going to be there in most cases if we can't find an economic use for many of them. And here's when, and of course this is a great example because you have kind of both ends in Arkansas. Historic resources are most at risk when there's a whole bunch of money or when there's no money. And when there's a whole bunch of money, it's just a temptation, well, I got to tear down stuff so we can have some gizmo building built. And when there's no money, then the roof doesn't get fixed and the water wrecks the building. So those are the kind of polar ends where they're at the most risk. So with all of that as background, what I'm going to spend this first session doing is talk about some of the lessons and the numbers that have been learned of the economic role of historic preservation in these areas. Jobs and household income, property values, heritage tourism, commercial district revitalization, foreclosure mitigation, a kind of really important one, the tax credit returns, I'll come to that, some international attention, some demolition money being foolishly spent, and economic competitiveness. So starting with jobs. So here's what happens. You got to fix up some old building. Well, you got to hire guys to do it. And one of the major impacts of historic preservation is that those jobs on restoring historic buildings are both labor intensive, and they're labor intensive into jobs that are relatively well paid, particularly for those without advanced formal education. And the two of those things together result in a significant local impact. A few years ago in Delaware, they have a state tax credit in Delaware. It had been passed with a 10-year sunset, and the time was coming up when the 10 years was up. And so both the Historic Preservation Office, but also the economic development people in the state of Delaware said, we ought to take a look at how effective it's been. And so we did a study in Delaware. And it's a state, as many of you know, still has a manufacturing component. Many of you have worked with these kind of economic development analyses. You have these big econometric models about impacts and indirect and induced and blah, blah, blah. But they all start out with this. You identify, and I couldn't create a model, but I can use it. There's 450 or 470 categories of economic activity, depending on whose model, but they're largely the same. So everything you can think of. Flipping hamburgers, selling cars, manufacturing cars, growing rice. And in the system we use, Implan, which many of you probably have a comfort with, I think there's 450 or 470 categories of industry. And then the measurements are, if there is $1 million worth of output from that industry, if GM manufactures $1 million worth of cars, if a lawyer writes $1 million worth of wills, if McDonald's sells $1 million of hamburgers, what happens? And those measurements are in how many jobs does that mean to create $1 million worth of wills or $1 million worth of hamburgers, and how much are paid as a result of those jobs. Well, in the state of Delaware, you manufacture $1 million worth of something, and there's 9.2 jobs created in the state of Delaware. Now, there's probably some jobs over in New Jersey and Pennsylvania and maybe New York from that Delaware industry, but $1 million of manufacturing output in Delaware means 9.2 jobs in the state of Delaware. You spend $1 million, you build a new building in the state of Delaware, that's 11 jobs. You rehabilitate an historic building in the state of Delaware, 14 jobs. But those jobs have paychecks. And so those people work on the assembly lines and the direct and indirect job from that manufacturing output in Delaware. That's about $344,000 worth of paychecks that $1 million worth of manufacturing output generated. In new construction, build that new building, about $477,000 of paychecks in the state of Delaware. You rehabilitate a historic building, $540 million worth of paychecks in Delaware. Georgia's a different economy, different state and a different economy, and a more diverse economy than Delaware. And the good citizens of Georgia a few years ago spent, I don't know, $1 gazillion or so to recruit an automobile manufacturing plant in the state of Georgia. Well, that's okay, it's their money, they can do what they want. But you manufacture $1 million worth of cars in Georgia, 3.5 jobs and $250,000 worth of paychecks. Many of you have been through the horrible Atlanta airport, which, by the way, tonight I have to go back through. But so $1 million worth of those airline tickets, one of the busiest airports in the world, that's a little less than 9 jobs and less than $500,000 in income. Well, and here's the one that you know in Arkansas. You produce $1 million worth of chickens. You produce a lot of stuff. One of them is 10 jobs and $426,000 in income. You rehabilitate an historic building in the state of Georgia, 18 jobs, for $750,000 in income. Where's the economic development? Here's a study we did in Utah and looked at a number of these industries. And again, it's how many jobs, how much income, and then this issue of what's the income per job. And just to pick a few, there's couple of categories that in fact have more jobs per $1 million worth of output than does rehabilitation. But look at what they are. Home health care services, somebody going up to, take care of your grandmother in her house, and restaurants and bars. So it just takes lots of human beings to provide that much in goods or services, but the problem is they aren't very well paid jobs. On the other, there's a couple home health care services simply because there's so many that there's more income per $1 million of output because it's mostly just labor. But if you look at and a few that have more income per job than does historic preservation down at the bottom. But look at those jobs. All of those are in very highly educated categories. So when you say where there's lots of jobs created per output, those jobs are relatively well paid, particularly with those without a law degree or a master's degree. In fact, historic building rehabilitation is one of the most powerful local economic development activities that there is, period. So the first kind of broad area is what does it mean in terms of jobs and household income? The second area is this issue of property values. What does it mean when there's a local district and you have some extra hoops you have to go through to change your porch? And it's probably the area that's been looked at the most in most parts of the country by different people using different methodologies with an extraordinarily consistency of answers. And I'll just give you some of them. A great firm, wasn't my firm, a great really smart people actually in Philadelphia, did a study of 30 years of property values in the city of Philadelphia. And you all know this, I'm just saying it because the issue is going to come up repeatedly. We have National Register Historic Districts. They're a very nice honorary thing. And they provide, if it's a commercial property, they're the threshold to get historic federal tax credits. But there's no protections. There's no protections on being the National Register. None, zip, zilch, nada, nothing. Unless there's some federal expenditure involved. You can tear an historic landmark down tomorrow if you're a private owner, private building. No protections come with National Register listings. The only way that historic buildings are protected is when you have a local preservation ordinance. So they looked at properties in Philadelphia on 30-year period on what their change in value was. Properties in local historic districts, properties in National Register districts, but not in local districts and in the rest of the city. And what they find over the period, the ones that appreciated the most was the local historic districts. Now, some of you maybe serve on or serve as staff to your local preservation commission. Nobody's paying a premium for the privilege of appearing before your goofy commission. They're paying the premium in the confidence that the lunatic across the street can't be doing something to his or her house that's going to have an adverse effect on yours. So here's what they found, is that these in Philadelphia, that the creation of the local historic district gave a bump of about 2% in the value of those properties, and that there was a rate of appreciation about 1% greater over that time. Well, I took their numbers and kind of dug back in, and here's what it turned out to be. The people like historic properties, and so they're paying a premium of about 21% just for these historic properties, as National Register properties, but they're paying an additional premium. They're paying about a 21% premium for ones where there's that local environmental protection. Now again, it's a bit counterintuitive of saying, well, more regulation, doesn't everybody tell us more regulation means lower values? Well, maybe in some industries, areas it does. Certainly it's not true here. It just simply is not true, and it's a consistent response. Probably the best study done in the U.S. was done by a guy at the University of Louisville, John Gilderbloom, and he looked on a census tract basis, on a hedonic pricing method, blah, 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 in Louisville, in every census tract, where in the hedonic pricing method, and I'm not the geek guy, but it is the mathematical tool where you sort out the relative contribution of all the significant variables. So why does one property sell for more or less than another? Well, what was its size? Did it have a garage? What part of town was it located in? Does it have a swimming pool? All those things. So they go in, sort out all of the variables except one. It is in or it is not in a local historic district. So that's the only remaining unaccounted for variable. And what did they find? That the properties in the historic district were worth about $60,000 more than houses in the comparable house, not, with everything else accounted for. And that over their 8-year study period, that the properties in the historic district appreciated 21% more than did the houses, comparable houses otherwise. Here's a study we did in Connecticut, in the town of Canton, Connecticut, that's about 40 miles north and west of Hartford. So there's the town boundaries. The pink is the National Register Historic District, within which is a local historic district. Again, all of the local is within the National Register District. National Register covers maybe a third of it. So what happened? Well, over the 5-year period between assessments in Canton, properties in the National Register District went up 28%, in the local historic district 32%, rest of the town 22%. I came here from Raleigh, North Carolina, and we just finished a study on the economic impact of preservation in Raleigh. And here's 2000 to 2008, City of Raleigh, local historic districts, National Register. Again, the ones where there's extra hoops, the ones that you have to get approval to make the changes, are the ones, in fact, that saw the greatest rates of appreciation. But here's a weirdness about these numbers, by the way. Look at this, 2000 to 2008, and those are numbers because that was the period of reassessment of the properties, and we used the assessment level for basis. Here was Connecticut, and that was, I think, 2003 to 2008, because that was their assessment. And here's Gilderbloom stuff that was 2000 to 2007. Well, what's wrong with those numbers? I mean, they were the best available data, but all of them end when the whole country's world's real estate crash comes about, and there wasn't kind of comparable subsequent data. So what about this situation? What happens when the market goes to hell? Well, the thing that's in my business life over the course of a year, the job that I have that's the least profitable but most fun is this course that I teach up at the University of Pennsylvania in the spring. And I learn way more from the students than they learn from me. And a couple of years ago, one of my students said, I want to look at foreclosures of single-family houses in Philadelphia at the height of the real estate crisis. So that's what she did, and there it is. 5,000 in a 12-month period, 5,000 foreclosures in Philadelphia, and as you can see, scattered all over the city. Well, when you start drilling down, however, the patterns are a little different. It's not that the historic districts are totally immune, but clearly just spatially you can say there's something happening different there. So she took 6 historic districts and found 10 comparable neighborhoods. In most cases, the neighborhoods were side by side, but a similar makeup of demographic makeup of the neighborhoods, similar age of housing, great similarity. And my technical background is a real estate appraiser, so this really is the kind of comparability question. And what did she find? Is that the foreclosure rates in those historic districts half of what it was in the comparable neighborhoods. So I'm saying, wow, that's kind of interesting. I'm stealing her methodology, and we're going to go and look at it in Connecticut. And while it varied some, and in Connecticut, if you don't know the state, there's some places that are among the richest in the country, and some that are really struggling places. And we had case study towns in all categories. In every one of them, the foreclosure rate in historic districts decidedly less, and lo and behold, on an aggregated basis, the same answer. Foreclosure rates half in the local historic districts. So then we go out and do this study in Utah. Look at 5 cities, very different cities, same answer. And in the case of Salt Lake City, foreclosure rate in historic districts, a third of what it was in the city as a whole. Now, here's where HUD and FHA and the Freddie Mac and Fannie Mae and the Bankers Association ought to be paying attention. This is no statistical fluke. It's pattern after pattern. And in case you think, oh, well, that's because maybe in Salt Lake those were all the rich neighborhoods and they were not suffering from that, wasn't the case at all. Here are the local historic districts in average values in the city of Salt Lake. There's in the checked one in the middle is the average for the city. So half of the local districts, in fact, have average values higher, and half of them lower than the city as a whole. So it wasn't just, oh, this is rich people who cashed in CDs to prevent foreclosure. It wasn't it at all. Here is the National Register districts. Even more dramatic is that about 2/3 of them have an average value less than the the city as a whole, and yet this foreclosure pattern was consistent. That is less foreclosures dramatically. And again, here's Raleigh, just finished it, looked at all of the foreclosures for a 5-year period in Raleigh. That 1 in 10 houses, single-family houses in Raleigh went into foreclosure over that time period. And we just, so for kind of ease of looking at it, we call it, number of foreclosures per 1,000, so that was 100 per 1,000. There's what the National Register districts were, that's what the local districts were. This is not a statistical fluke. Here you have Connecticut, Philadelphia, North Carolina, Utah with the same answer. Half of the foreclosure. Now, it's not because, oh, well, yeah, all those people who love to live in historic neighborhoods, they never get divorced, they never lose their job, they never run their credit card bill up. That's not it at all. What's happening, I think, is that if I get in financial trouble and I got to get out, I can get that property sold before it gets to that foreclosure point. That the values are more stable. They don't take that big dip. And so I can get out. If I get in trouble, I can get out. And I think that that's what we're seeing here. Again, a huge, huge thing, I think, in terms of economics and historic preservation. Well, the third area that I want to talk about is heritage tourism and the incremental difference about heritage tourism. Now, here's what I have to say. My lifetime goal, seriously, is to break this pattern that when you say historic preservation and economic development in the same sentence, that the default response is, oh, you must be talking about heritage tourism. It's very important. I like it. It's good, positive results. It's not the only way that historic preservation adds to the local economy. But it makes an important link, and I want to talk to some of them. Again, this firm in Philadelphia looked at the 5-county region of southeast Pennsylvania, which includes Philadelphia, and looked at the heritage-based tourism. $3 billion in output, 45,000 jobs, almost $1 billion in earnings. Huge numbers, but no surprise, for God's sake. It's the cradle of American democracy and Independence Hall. Huge numbers. Yeah, okay. Arkansas. Now, I love your state. I don't think it's a state that in most people's, oh, that's the big heritage tourism state. Doesn't mean you don't have great stuff, but I don't think that shows at the top of the list. A few years ago, David Listikin from Rutgers did an excellent statewide economic impact study in Arkansas. And here's what he found, that only 16% of the visitors that come to visitors in Arkansas, tourists in Arkansas, would be categorized as heritage tourists. But they spend 30% more money than other kinds of tourists. And secondly, if somebody goes from Little Rock to Hot Springs for the day and spends some money, that's okay. It's good for the Hot Springs economy, but it really has no net effect on the state's economy. It's just money moving from one place in the state to another. When you get a positive impact, economic impact, is when people are coming from some other place into Arkansas and spending their money. And much more likely, heritage tourists, much more likely to be out of state coming to Arkansas than other kinds of categories. But even though this is a relatively small share of your tourism industry, still means 21,000 jobs and $320 million worth of income in the state. And importantly, when state legislators are trying to say, how do we, make the payments to the highway patrol and fix potholes, $74 million worth of tax revenues in Arkansas from the heritage portion of the tourism industry. Florida. Again, Florida is a state that you say, well, yeah, beaches and Disney World and golf. And yeah, it's their biggest industry by far. But almost half of U.S. visitors who go to Florida for any reason, whatever they're going there for, in fact, visit an historic site while they're there. And just the heritage portion, relatively small chunk of Florida's tourism industry, is $4 billion industry and a huge impact on the economy. The U.S. Department of Commerce does a good job of surveying visitors who come, international visitors who come into the U.S. by plane, on what they're going to do and what they spent and so forth. And they do it by plane to get rid of the kind of skew that the daily visitors just across the border from Canada or Mexico would cause. So this is people getting on a plane someplace, flying to the U.S. Now, I don't know if any of you are in the tourism business, but I have to say the definitions are all kind of fuzzy in tourism. They like to pretend they're exact, they aren't. In the appraisal business, we used to call it spurious accuracy. It's not really as accurate as you're trying to make it sound. But they have a category called cultural tourist, within which are heritage tourists. And my best guess is probably 80% of cultural tourists are heritage tourists. I suppose if you go to the opera in a new opera house, you're a cultural tourist, but not a heritage tourist. But mostly there's an overlap, and so the numbers would be largely coincident. So what did they find? Well, first of all, those cultural tourists spend about half again as many nights in hotels as do other kinds of tourists. They visit 2 or more states. Here's why this is important. If it's an international visitor coming to the U.S. and visiting one state, that state's going to be New York, Florida, California. Just is. The rest of us 47 states, if we're going to take advantage of the international visitors, then we have to have visitors willing to go to more than one state, and here's a pattern much more true of cultural tourists than other kinds. They spend more every one of their trips than do visitors at large. 470,000 more international visitors to the U.S. go to visit historic sites than visit amusement parks. 785,000 more go to historic sites than go to the beach. 3 times as many go to historic sites as go to casinos. 4 times as many go to historic sites than play golf. So and I'm telling you, this international heritage stuff is huge and growing. And in the next 30 years, we're going to see gargantuan middle-class tourism from China and India. And what are they going to look at? Interesting enough, even those 2 countries have huge heritage of their own, they're going to be looking at our heritage. There are, by the way, as a little side fact, there are today more millionaires in India than there is population of Australia. It tells you the kind of coming impact that all that's going to have. And I don't know if any of you are involved in historic sites or what your involvement is, but here's what often happens. You know, you're getting some, $20,000 a year to pay the light bill from the city council or somebody, and they say, well, you guys, you're not even paying the admission fees, you're not even paying the operating costs, we're going to quit. So you're a big loser and we can't take care of you. Well, A, that's true of most of those places. But B, here's what the significance of this is. And what's interesting is the same ratio comes up in studies all over the world. We did this study in Utah where we looked at historic sites in Utah. Many of them are very remote, far away from Salt Lake or Provo or Ogden, the big cities. Only about 7% of that heritage visitor's money was actually spent at the historic site. It was the magnet that brought them to those places, but it wasn't the historic site, it was the beneficiary. It was the hotels, the gas stations, the restaurants, the retail shops. They got the 93% of all that heritage visitors' dollar, but it was the heritage site that brought them there. So it's kind of like the loss leader at Kmart. You're going there because they're selling, aluminum garbage cans for 50 cents. Well, they had to pay $12 for them. Doesn't matter. That's what got you into the store. That's kind of what these historic sites are doing. They're bringing people to the town, and then the rest of the town, in fact, is by far the bigger beneficiary. And then tax credit returns. And I'm making a stupid pun there. And this photo is appropriate because, in fact, it is a regional IRS headquarters. So anyway. Here's a little test. So here's this quotation. The completed projects have brought revenue life to deteriorated business and residential districts, created new jobs and new housing units, increased local and state revenues, and helped ensure the long-term preservation of irreplaceable cultural resources. A $10 reward for anybody who can identify the source of the quotation. Well, it could be like the president of the National Trust for Historic Preservation, or the, chair of the National Endowment for the Arts, or the, executive director of Preservation Action, or somebody. Could be the state historic preservation officer in Arkansas. No, the Internal Revenue Service is the one who identified that as this effective tool for changing neighborhoods. And I don't see many IRS memberships in the National Trust. And here is how it works in a kind of simplified fashion. We recently did a study for the National Trust on the catalytic impact of the historic tax credit projects. Historic tax project takes place. But that's not the end of the story. Then stuff starts happening around it in this consistent pattern. But here, just in kind of simplified fashion, is what all of that means. First of all, because the federal tax credit means I got to put up $4 to get $1 in tax credits, a 20% tax credit. So it starts out with this private sector dollars going into it. So I spend $800,000, I get $200,000 in tax credits. Structure. What does that mean? 16 jobs, and jobs mean full-time equivalent jobs for 1 year. That means 885,000 of economic activity added to the economy as a result of that. 256,000 in federal, state, and local taxes generated by my $1 million rehabilitation. And in the end, my $1 million investment in that building ends up being a $2.1 million addition to the gross national product because of those impacts. So it's a huge impact. In fact, again, Listigan at Rutgers, and he's probably the best academic guy who looks at this stuff, looked at the whole life of the federal tax credit and said, how much does it cost the federal government? Because a tax credit is called a tax expenditure. So the fact that somebody got a tax credit means that the rest of us bore that burden, because that's dollars that otherwise would have been in the general fund. So there's a cost. And that cost over time is not significant. I think that it's about $20 billion now over the lifetime that's cost the taxpayers. But Listigan followed those projects through. For every dollar that the tax credit cost the taxpayers, those projects ultimately generated for the federal treasury $1.24. Now, how many federal government programs, in fact, generate more for the federal treasury than they cost? Well, the answer is damn few. But the rehabilitation tax credit, one of them. And yet, it's on the list of, we got to get rid of this in the name of tax reform. It's just idiocy. So the next broad area is this issue about the role of historic preservation in center city revitalization and downtown revitalization. And this is where I spend, in the last 30 years, I've spent most of my time, downtown revitalization stuff. And I have to tell you, I can't identify a single sustained success story any place in America of sustained success in downtown revitalization where historic preservation wasn't part of that strategy. Not one. Now, maybe it's theoretically possible to have downtown revitalization and no historic preservation. I haven't seen it, I haven't been there, and I go to 100 towns a year. I haven't heard of it, I haven't read of it. Conversely, the examples of very expensive failures in downtown revitalization have nearly always included at the core, let's get rid of this old buildings. Now, the relative role of it will change from place to place, more in some cities than others, depending on the leadership, the inventory of structures and others. But downtown revitalization, no historic preservation, it ain't happening. Anyway, as you all know, in Arkansas for 25 years or so, there's been a great program called Main Street. The program started at the National Trust, and Main Street is downtown revitalization in the context of historic preservation. That's what it is. And the good thing about one of the good things about Main Street is that every program makes their poor local managers keep track of stuff and report it. And so over the last few years, we've done a number of studies based on these, some cases, dusty old files in some state office of Main Street programs. Georgia has a state Main Street program. It was one of the early ones, and they also have a companion program for small towns called the Better Hometowns program, but still operates under Main Street, same concept. Well, Georgia is a state that has suffered economically in the first decade of the 21st century. That, in fact, in 3 of the first 10 years, they had fewer people employed in the state of Georgia the 1st of January than they did the year before. Tough economic times, and yet every year in that state, in that tough economy, there was a net growth in net new jobs in those Main Street communities. That in 4 of the first 10 years, in fact, there was less revenue going into the state treasury than the year before, lower tax revenues. So I feel sorry for the legislators saying, what are we going to do? We got less money to work with, and yet every year over those 10 years, more growth in net new businesses in those Main Street communities. It is against the trend success story. Michigan, you all know Michigan, they have a relatively new Main Street program, only 10 years old, and they kind of wanted to look at where they were after 10 years. And Michigan, so Michigan, with the whole industry, in Michigan going to hell, and then compounded by being, 3 or 4 years of recession in this decade that they've been around. And so the red line is oh my God, I turned it off. I won't even try. Is it this one? It doesn't matter. The red line is what's happened year to, which one is it? Oh, this guy, the obvious one. The red line is, well, I'm pretty oblivious to most stuff, so no surprise there. The red line is the year-to-year change in jobs in the state of Michigan. Here's the side of this. So here in 2008 to 2009, they were down 300,000 jobs in the state of Michigan. So huge, and they began to recover, and then the recovery kind of petered out. Every year in those Michigan Main Street, so same town, same state, same recession, they in fact gained net jobs in all those years. And here is one of my favorites, actually. This is, I'm going to show you, this is the Michigan Main Street numbers again. There is a number that the Department of Commerce keeps track of. Excuse me. And that is, what's the ratio of businesses that open to businesses that close? And obviously over the long haul, you have to have more businesses that open than close, or you're going to have a shrinking economy. So it only goes to 2011 because that's where their data stops. But over the long haul, that ratio will be about 1.1 or 1.2 to 1. That is 11 or 12 businesses opening for every 10 that close. So here's the national numbers. You can see here 2004, good economy, about 1.3 to 1. A little better in 2005. It was kind of the forewarning of a recession coming, and the kind of official dates of the beginning of the recession, end of 2007. So 2008, as many businesses closed as opened. By 2009, more closed than opened. Same was true in 2010. 2011 got back up to about even. So you can really track these business openings to closings as the recession. Here was the ratio of business openings to closings in Michigan Main Street communities. Every year over that 10-year period, same recession in a tough state, they had more businesses opening than closing by ratios of 1.5 or 2 to 1. What does that mean? That means this strategy of preservation-based downtown revitalization creates an environment, a context in which businesses can both open in tough times and stay open in tough times. Huge success story. So New Mexico, another state with a tough economy. It has this kind of band of prosperity between Santa Fe and Albuquerque, and the rest of it's tough economics. And most of their Main Street communities, little places scattered around the state, but with the same answer. The same answer, that the ratio of businesses opening to business closing blow you away different than it was for the country as a whole. In Iowa, which has a very good Main Street program, about almost 30 years over now. What we calculated when we looked at their numbers is not the property taxes from the town or even the buildings in the downtown, just the property tax receipts from the reinvestment in those buildings. Additional investment in those buildings generates every year almost $11 million for local governments to pay cops, teachers' salaries, fixing potholes. In fact, the sales tax revenues to the state of Iowa from the net, not all the businesses, from the net new businesses in Main Street communities generates about $43 million in the most recent year in sales tax for the state treasury. And this is a program that cost the state in Iowa about $950,000 a year. So 45 times as much coming into the state treasury from the new businesses in those districts as the program costs. In North Carolina, not dissimilarly, about almost 4 times as much coming in from the new activity as the state program costs them. But it's not just Main Street, and it's just not in the U.S. In projects that the EU funds, unlike most of our programs, either at the federal or the state governments here, some agency funds it, but then doesn't set aside the funds to say, oh, well, when it's done, let's look and see if it worked or not. Well, they do it in the EU. And so a group of European towns said, we want a kind of a coalition of towns, said we want heritage-based center city revitalization. EU gave them some money, but they said, but you got to track stuff for us. So here was one of them was Norwich, England. Pedestrian flows up 60 to 300%. 40% of pedestrians stay longer. 24% of pedestrians come more often. Now, I don't know how many of you have ever been in the retail business, or the shopping center business, or have clients who are, but those are the big three. How many people come, how long they stay, how often they come back. It's all three of those measures in this heritage-based downtown revitalization. 80% of elderly and 90% of families with child support project, significant reduction in noise and air pollution. This actually brings up another issue, is in the US, the environmental movement has somehow converted the word sustainable development to mean only, how many units of electricity we're using per square foot, or some narrowly environmental measurement. That is not sustainable development. The international framework for sustainable development certainly includes the environmental responsibility, but also economic responsibility and social and cultural responsibility. So look at this. So here you have one effort, heritage-based center city revitalization, and you got economic returns, you got social returns, you got environmental returns. And then one of the other towns was Ghent in Belgium. 84% of visitors come back, reduction of accidents, improved access to people with disabilities, reduction of vehicle flows, new cultural institutions. Again, economic responsibility, cultural responsibility, environmental. One effort that does all three broadly defined, not our goofy US environmental movement, overly narrow defined sustainable development. Inter-American Development Bank has been funding for almost 2 decades heritage center city revitalization projects in Latin America. But they decided, well, we've been doing it so long, maybe we ought to take a breath and look back and see if it's worked. And so they found 10 places around the world that had had heritage-based center city revitalization. Some that they had funded in Latin America, but a lot that they didn't have anything just happen someplace else in the world. So they hired academics and kind of gave them the framework of the research to look at all of, I think, 10 or 11 cities. And you can see them. Some in Latin America, but different economies, different cultures, different religions, different social and economic and political systems. Looked at all of these and very differences, but here was I read all the studies. Here was the common denominator. More private investment, more middle class returning to the center city to live, increasing property values, more businesses, tax generation, better property maintenance, lower vacancy. All of the kinds of things when you're in the business of downtown revitalization saying, what do we want to happen? This is what you want to happen. And all of the world, heritage-based downtown revitalization have provided those. Now to the kind of issue of international attention. At the beginning of the recession, the European Parliament held hearings on the role of heritage conservation in economic downturns. The equivalent hearings in the US Congress, I guess I must have missed the notice in the Federal Register or something. That same year, the European Heads of Heritage Forum, which is basically the cultural ministers from across Europe, devoted their 2-day annual session on that issue, heritage in times of recession. And this was their conclusion. All the evidence demonstrates that investment in heritage is an inherently sustainable, long-term, and measurably successful solution to economic recession. The European Investment Bank, the World Bank, the Asian Development Bank, the Inter-American Development Bank have all increased their lendings on heritage-based projects around the world. And even the kind of highfalutin purist preservation types like ICOMOS and the Council of Europe have kind of moved to say, yeah, maybe we ought to be talking about this economic side of things. A year ago in London, there was a symposium on creative financing for heritage, and who is the sponsor? The European Development Bank, in fact, who makes more loans than does the World Bank. And then maybe the crowning achievement of getting people to pay attention is the World Bank recently put out a book called The Economics of Uniqueness, that is this role of what's the connection between local economies and heritage. I hate to be political. I don't hate to be political. I'm going to be political. There's a thing. So we have this big national crisis in real estate. Hundreds of thousands of people losing their home to foreclosure. So Congress says we need to respond to that. And so let's give hundreds of millions of dollars in the hardest hit fund to help those places. Theoretically, it was to help people who was getting houses foreclosed on. Yeah, well, that's not what the money went for. not what the money as we speak is going for. It's to tear crap down. That's what it's for. Cities are using the hardest hit funds to tear stuff down. Well, in some of these cities, stuff needs to be torn down. I have no quarrel with that. I'm not saying nothing should ever be torn down. Here's the issue. The Department of Treasury decided to say, screw you, National Historic Preservation Act, that these hundreds of millions of dollars that ought to be subject to 106 review under the National they're exempt from that. They're exempt from that. White House lets it go. National Trust says, oh yeah, well, we don't want to sue the Treasury Department. Terrible, 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 and hundreds of millions of dollars going. Well, and much of this is done by land banks, and land banks are a very good tool, but the land bank in Cleveland funded a study to kind of prove that this demolition is really a good thing. I'm telling you, it's urban renewal 2.0. Their own study. Look at what's happened. Now, where is the cause the worst? Well, in extremely weak or weak neighborhoods. But you know what? It's a negative impact by their own study. All this demolition, in fact, is a net negative. The only place, and they say, oh, this really works because overall it's generating this much in positive. Yeah, in the rich white folks' neighborhoods where there's a rotten house that they tear something down, the places that have always gotten screwed in federal programs like urban renewal are the ones getting screwed in the hardest hit fund. Absolutely unconscionable, and nobody's doing anything. So I don't feel strongly about it, but I just thought I'd mention it. Then an issue about economic competitiveness. My new best friend is a guy by the name of John O'Brien, who for a number of years was in charge of direct foreign investment for Ireland. And you all know that Ireland was one of the countries that really took a hit in the kind of devaluation and the recession, and the first to get out of it. But even over that time, the city of Dublin and the industries in Dublin have been pretty successful. And for almost 20 years, Dublin has really been a center of really knowledge worker in-migration, both Irish coming back and people coming from elsewhere to work in Ireland. And that was John O'Brien's job, to get the companies to come there. So he made this little map, and it was of all of the high-tech companies that had a presence in Dublin. And you can see, I mean, everybody you can think of has a presence there. And so here is John, and John O'Brien will tell you this. He says, I never care about this heritage conservation stuff. But he said, this is my job to get these companies. He said, I got to be honest, the companies came because we have this really smart, young, knowledge-based workforce. That's where they're coming. But he said, then I had to ask the question, well, why are those young people coming? Why are they coming? They're attracting the industry. And he said, well, they're coming for quality of life reasons. And that our heritage inventory in Dublin is a major portion of that quality of life criteria. He said, that's the connection. He said, now, some of these buildings, some of these businesses, some of them are in historic buildings, some of them are across the street, some of them aren't anywhere close, but that's not what matters. Not that these businesses are filling historic buildings. It's that our historic buildings are attracting the young people that are attracting these companies to go there. So that's kind of interesting. And then by karma, you know, I hate to tell you all of this, but I'm not a planner. And I'll tell you, and I do have a mantra in life. So how any of you remember the Rajneesh? He was kind of this cult leader, and then the last he was in Antelope, Oregon, and they kicked him out. He's one of these guys, you know, would leave with like 12, you know, white Rolls Royce, you know, limousine stuff. And then he went to India or someplace, and he was about to be kicked out of India. And a Washington Post reporter kind of caught up to him and said, well, Rajneesh, what are you going to do now? And he said, planning is bondage. So I don't know, it's probably not your mantra, but I'm just telling you that. But I say that because I don't plan anything, and so everything I do is kind of serendipitous. And I happened to be doing a thing in Rotterdam with the Dutch Culture Ministry a couple years ago, and met a guy who works for Erasmus University who's really on the geeky end of the geek spectrum of economists. And he looks at patterns of direct foreign investment. And he has this gargantuan database that costs his university like 120 euros a year just to subscribe to the database. But it tracks all of these pieces of direct foreign investment that a firm in Cleveland makes an investment in Johannesburg, and that a firm based in Nairobi invests in Tokyo, or whatever. So he's thousands and thousands, tens of thousands of transactions. And so I'm listening to him, and then I sat down with him and I said, all right, if this pattern of, for the first time in human history, actually jobs are following people, and that people are going where they want to go and the jobs are following them. And if where those people are going is based on quality of life criteria, and if heritage is a big part of the quality of life criteria, we ought to see a difference in patterns of direct foreign investment in places with heritage. So that was the thesis to be tested. And so we set up this model. We looked at European cities for kind of revenue reasons and kind of a pilot test. And we said, we're going to define the heritage cities as, number one, cities that are on the World Heritage List, but two, are also members of the Organization of World Heritage Cities. The second being, well, they think it's enough of an asset that they voluntarily then join this other organization. And we're going to look at those. And so 29 cities in Europe met that test. And then this geeky economist, Ron Wall, said, all right, so now we have to make this scientific. Now we're going to look for cities that have the same criteria but don't meet that heritage thing. So similar in size, similar in density, similar in location, even used pollution levels. So the whole wide range of variables of competing cities, and he found 190 of them that were comparable to the 29, and then looked at the patterns, differing patterns, if any, amount of direct foreign investment in those things. Looked over a 10-year period. What did he find? That those heritage cities typically got 41 more instances of direct foreign investment than did their comparable cities. That's no accident. Something's happening there. In fact, those young knowledge workers are making choices, and heritage is clearly part of that equation. They haven't even printed the paper yet, so you're ahead of the curve here. Then I was doing some work a couple of months ago in Seattle, Washington, where there's one of the great historic commercial neighborhoods in America, Pioneer Square in Seattle. And there was a young real estate guy who they'd never heard of me, and certainly never heard of John O'Brien or his little chart. But Seattle, it's where Amazon, where Google, where all the high-tech thing is. So he made a map of logos. He didn't know anything else. This was just sheer randomness of high-tech companies in Seattle, in Pioneer Square, with a map that looks remarkably like the map in Dublin. And mostly in Pioneer Square, it's not Google, or it's not Amazon, it's all the little 3-person, 5-person, 8-person firms that are writing some geeky piece of code then that they're selling off to Amazon or to do whatever they do. Consistent pattern. So kind of the lesson of all of this, good historic preservation means good economics.